You need testimony that the husband is dead, or you need testimony that the husband was in a situation in which there were no survivors. That's called the Kiddushon Shel Eish rule. So if we have testimony that the husband was pushed into a furnace and the door was closed, even though we know that we didn't see him die, we know that nobody survives this activity, and thus that is sufficient. This produces the conversation that the Gemara spends a lot of time on, called the Mayim She'ein Lahem Sof. It's the man who goes out in a boat. The boat sinks. There are some survivors, but we don't know where the survivors are. None of the women whose husbands are on that boat can remarry. We need proof that this specific and every specific man died, because the rabbis were afraid that these men would wash ashore in another place, and they wouldn't be able to return home, and they wouldn't be able to communicate with their wives at home, and they were still married and seeking to return home, but incapable of doing so. That was the rabbinic decree of Mayim She'ein Lahem Sof. That is the root source of the Agunot problem in Talmudic times. And it's worth sort of digging a little bit deeper to understand this. The rabbis recognized that the consequences of withholding a death certificate in this situation were harsh. And they weren't insensitive people. But they did this because they realized that the consequences of liberally granting death certificates was also going to be harsh. And there's a very famous story that you can read about on the internet. It's written up by a person who's not quoted in synagogue frequently, which is President Jimmy Carter, who writes a wonderful story about his uncle named Tom Gordy. Tom Gordy was a Marine in Guadalcanal, and he was involved in a terrible explosion and accident. And everybody assumed he was dead because when the explosion was over, his body was gone. But actually, he had been taken prisoner by the Japanese and shipped to Japan. This was in the Battle of Guadalcanal. His wife, who lived in Plains, Georgia, got a letter from the Department of Defense saying, "We have terrible news, your husband has been killed." She got a widow's pension. She promptly remarried Tom Gordy's best friend, which was perceived at the time to be a chesed by all. She had small children. Her husband's best friend married her. They were happily living a life until at the end of World War II, 4 years later, Tom Gordy comes back from his time in a prisoner of war camp, appears unexpectedly and says, "I'm home." His wife, of course, says, "You're dead." He says, "That seems to have been incorrect." Tragedy resulted all around. Tom Gordy killed himself in desperation. His wife killed herself out of desperation. The whole situation went bad very quickly because these were only good people doing the right and proper things that they needed to do. He was a good person for surviving 3 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. She was a good person for remarrying somebody who would help take care of the children and allow her to rebuild his life. He spent his 3 years in prisoner of war camp writing loving letters to his wife saying, "I can't wait to see you," which of course the Japanese did not deliver. Tragedy only results, Chazal recognized, from false declarations of death, and they thought that these tragedies were greater in totality than the tragedies that resulted from the decision not to remarry. And history, if you read it, is full of these cases. Tom Gordy's not the only one. These are common problems in American law, which in fact declares people dead based on all sorts of interesting evidence and is wrong on occasion, because nobody's right all the time. But if you declare things based on statistical evidence, what do you know for sure? It's not exceptions, it's that you're wrong 1% of the time. When you say this is 99% likely, what you mean is 1 in every 100 cases you will be resolved differently. But if you resolve all 100 cases based on the 99% rule, then you acknowledge up front that 1% of the cases are wrong. Chazal were extremely uncomfortable with that in the context of marriage, out of fear of mamzerut, of illegitimacy, out of fear of tragedy, out of fear of incredible disruption of family life that results from a remarriage because you think your husband is dead only to have your husband reappear. The truth is that Chazal's rule bothered a group of Rishonim. And while they didn't word their bother as a direct challenge of Chazal, they worded their bother by explaining that as technology evolves, Chazal's fear that the husband will be alive but be incapable of communicating would seem to diminish. Rabbi Professor Verdun, writing in the 1300s, where the technology was fantastic, let me tell you, notes that he thinks that the rule doesn't apply in France, in Verdun, because they have a primitive post service. And if the husband were alive, you know what he would do? Write a letter. And it's true, it would take a long time to arrive, but if we wait 2 years and the husband doesn't communicate, that's sufficient proof that the husband is actually dead. His opinion is rejected by his peers, unanimously, without dissent, other than Rabbi Elazar Verdun's dissent. The Truma Sedeshin, who dies in 1469, notes that, while of course Rabbi Elazar Verdun is wrong because he was rejected, we should adopt Rabbi Elazar Verdun's rule in the time of the Truma Sedeshin, since look, by 1469, technology had progressed so well that there was more than a primitive post office, there was an active post office, and you really could mail letters. Of course, the Truma Sedeshin says they don't all arrive, but nearly all arrive, and presumably if the first letter from the husband doesn't arrive, what'll he do? Write again. Try it again. So again, the Truma Sedeshin says, after the passage of 2 or 3 years, we should let the wife remarry based on changes in time and technology. And his opinion is rejected as well. The Chassam Sofer, who dies in 1839, steps into this quagmire and says, look, Rabbi Elazar Verdun is wrong. And the Truma Sedeshin is wrong. But it's 1839 in Hungary, and it couldn't get any better than this. He says, we have the telegraph and the train service. And between the telegraph and the train service, no matter where the husband is, you know what he'll do? He'll either come home or send a telegraph. And thus, we should reject the Talmudic rule and accept that nowadays, in 1839 in Hungary, it doesn't come any more state-of-the-art than that, the Talmudic rule has been rejected. Rabbi Nata Greenblatt, who lives in Memphis, was born in the 1920s. Rabbi Nata's claim to fame is that he was in Rabbi Soloveitchik's kollel in Boston until 1940. Not a lot of people still alive can make that claim. He writes in a letter, I think I'm Shoel, on this letter. Rabbi Greenblatt says, even if you reject Rabbi Elazar Verdun and the Truma Sedeshin and the Chassam Sofer, nowadays, by the year 2002 in the United States, we keep track of everything and everybody, and nobody really disappears, and anybody anywhere can reach out and communicate no matter what. And Rav Nata adds, I'll go even further. Even if you don't want to communicate because you're running away, we can keep track of you because you can't really spend any money or charge anything on your credit card or step anywhere without, in fact, leaving an imprint. So nobody ever actually fully and successfully disappears. And I'll add, it's been 20 years, and the advent of facial recognition software has compounded Rav Nata's claim, because when we want to find you, they look for your picture on the government camera, making it even harder to disappear. Notwithstanding that fact, though, Rav Nata Greenblatt's view is rejected as well. We are deeply uncomfortable with this kind of statistical evidence. The evidence says as follows: because we have looked for you and not found you, that is proof that you are dead. we recognize that the power of people to disappear is frequently greater than the power of law enforcement to find them. And let me add something else. In my own practical experience in get refusal, this has demonstrated to me the incorrectness of Rav Nassau's view. People do disappear. And we do have a hard time keeping track of them, and we do have a hard time finding them, and they defeat the facial recognition software. They avoid detection through the financial services. If you make a conscious effort to fall off the grid, it is not as hard to fall off the grid as Rav Nassau actually thinks it is. Fundamentally, halacha is unamenable to the idea that we will prove to you that a husband is dead because we have seen neither hide nor hair of him. And working in the background of this is the following fear we have. While some husbands might have disappeared because they were injured or hurt, some husbands might be disappearing because it's an alternative to divorce. And they're consciously disappearing. They're using tragedy or difficulty as an opportunity to start their life all over again. It's just worth understanding that because of this, the most you'll get from contemporary halachic authorities is the approach Rabbi Moshe Feinstein articulates in response to the Holocaust. He says the decree of Mayim she'ein lahem sof, the idea that we'll be strict against the majority for fear that the husband is alive, doesn't apply, Rav Moshe writes, in situations like the Holocaust, in which there's been public tragedy involving tens of thousands or millions of people. The rabbis only made this decree, Rabbi Feinstein says, in situations in which there is small tragedy, rather than in situations based on global tragedy. Based on Rabbi Feinstein's analysis, the consensus of halachic authorities was that Holocaust survivors waited a few years. They examined the books that the Allies distributed listing all the survivors, and if after a few years of examining the books and waiting around and doing due diligence, their husband did not reappear, they were free to remarry based on the assumption that their husband had been killed in a death camp. That's what Rabbi Feinstein writes, and not only is that what he writes, that's what we assume is the halacha, and that was what was practiced routinely both in the United States and in Israel in the late 40s and the early 50s. But there's another truth out there as well, and this other truth is worth saying. Even as we grew clearer that we were not going to be lenient, like Rav Elazar Verdun, the Chasam Sofer, the Truma Sedeshin, and Rabbi Greenblatt, technology advanced more and more, so that cases of individual husbands disappearing who we thought were dead were frequently solved through technological innovation. While Rabbeinu Tam notes that when a husband is thrown off a boat and 5 days later he's found waterlogged and nibbled at by whatever is in the water, we can't believe the wife's identification of the husband's body based on the waterlogged corpse. Contemporary halachic authorities, going back 200 years, have already noted that advances in technology have solved many of these problems. The Shulchan Aruch says that the wife can't look at the husband's teeth and say, those are my husband's teeth, in the 1500s. But the Avnei Nezer, writing in the 1880s, says a dentist who comes in and testifies based on dental records that these are the teeth of this man, that's sufficient. And that dental records have been widely accepted in halacha starting in the end of the 1900s and the end of the 1800s to identify a husband. Bone records even more so, x-rays, and even general health records of any type. More broadly, we follow the view of the Pri Megadim, who says as follows: a siman mudhak, whatever exactly we consider it, a well-established sign that this is this person, which evolves over time and place, depending on the technology and the reality, has the same status as two witnesses, And once we can reasonably identify the body of the husband as this person's body, that allows us to note with halachic certainty that this husband is dead and the wife is free to remarry. So even as we grew stricter on statistical evidence, our eyes were open to advances in technology such that on a practical level, the problems of 1550, which is a man disappears and a corpse is found, but we have a hard time actually identifying the missing person and the corpse, because they didn't have pictures, they didn't have any accurate method of identification. Technology has more or less solved that problem by allowing extremely accurate, high-level identification. Even just the idea of a photograph profoundly affects how these halachic matters work. We now recognize almost all corpses get identified. In the last 20 years, we've grown even better at this, but many years ago already, there were many very good ways to identify bodies. So even as halacha grew stricter and clearer that we were not going to accept statistical evidence, halacha grew more expansive in the variety of actual evidence it was prepared to accept. Almost all of the longest siman in the Shulchan Aruch, which is Yud Zayin in Even Ezer, has disappeared from practical halacha. Siman Yud Zayin spends its time discussing how state-of-the-art 1530, how much identification can be done given the reality. And it has all sorts of sort of interesting cases. You find a leg. Is that enough? Is a woman believed to say, those are my husband's toes in the year 1550? We find a body, we can't identify the body because it's been submerged for many days, but we can identify the clothes. Are we allowed to identify a person based on, these are his clothes? Or do we accept the fact that sometimes people lend out their clothes? In the time of the Shulchan Aruch, it was more common, it seems, for people to lend out clothes than it was in our current times. All of these things more or less resolve themselves so that by 1995, some idiot, and that idiot was me, put in writing that he thought that the historical Agunot problem had disappeared, because we could incessantly identify bodies with a high degree of accuracy. I actually put it in writing in 1995, because until that time I had been doing these cases and I had never encountered a case that gave me any difficulty. I had been involved in a plane crash or two, a helicopter crash, a variety of situations. And in every situation, which was a question about whether you could identify the body of the husband, we were always able to identify the body of the husband. The only difficult case I ever encountered, I spent a full year in the 90s thinking about this case, involved a jewelry merchant living in Columbus, Ohio, who turned to his wife one day and said, I'm going to a jewelry show in Toronto, and I'm taking the jewels with me. He held up a bag with, in 1990, $3 million of jewels in it, which in 1990 was a lot of money, as if it's not a lot of money now. And he disappeared and was never heard of at all, but his car was found, overturned with gunshots in it. But his body was not found, and there was no evidence in the car itself that he was dead. But we caught a person selling his jewels. Not me. Not the best in America. The police. The police. And he was interrogated and arrested, and he said to the police officer who was interrogating him, you'll never find the body. Which in court, he said, meant I didn't kill him. But we thought that was sufficient to permit the woman to remarry, and such is what happened. I say the story with some hesitation because one of my daughters was with me many years ago, and I told over the story, and a woman raised her hand and said, that was my father. And I assume after so many years that's not going to happen here, but I dealt with many such cases. Then 9/11 happened, and so many men disappeared. 78% of the people killed in 9/11 were men. Many of them were Jewish. Many of them were Orthodox, and they truly disappeared. They truly disappeared. No physical remnants were found of large numbers of people. If you were on any one of the planes that crashed, you disappeared. A few in one of the planes left a physical remnant in the Pentagon, but the two planes that crashed into the Twin Towers, no physical remnants were left at all. They were full of fuel, and the process of crashing them into the Twin Towers truly, totally, and completely evaporated every single person on the plane. They disappeared. Many people in the Twin Towers totally and completely disappeared. No remains were left at all of them. None. More than half of the victims left no physical remains at all. If you were in the towers when they collapsed, we found virtually nothing of you. The force of that 100-story building collapsing into a fiery inferno left almost nothing of anybody. Instead, we were left exactly with the kind of information that we encountered in the era of the Rishonim. Terrible, heart-rendering stories. Husbands who called their wives up and said, "I'm on the 93rd floor of the Twin Towers. Death is coming. I can't get out. I love you very much, and I'm calling to say goodbye. I love you." Or heart-rendering stories of firefighters or even volunteers who were running up and down the Twin Towers to try to bring people down. There was a member of the Riverdale Jewish Center named Andrew Zucker who did 3 trips up and down the Twin Towers. 84 stories. 84 stories went up and down to bring people down, bring people up and down. At the end of the 3rd trip, firefighter stopped him and said, "You shouldn't go up again. The building is going to collapse." And he said, "I'll make one more trip up." And he disappeared. The building collapsed and he died. He saved some 14 people, carrying people up and down the stairs. Heroes abounded. Firefighters were told, "Get out of the building. The building is going to collapse." The collapse of the building was not unexpected, neither of the 2nd tower, which collapsed first, nor of the 1st tower, which collapsed shortly thereafter. Firefighters were given 20 minutes notice that disaster was coming, and many firefighters said, "I'll make one more trip." And many of them made one more trip, and they came down, and you know what they said? "I'll make another trip. I'll go up and down only 10 flights. I'll take some more people down." There were people who, on the lower floors, who were alive, who couldn't get down because they couldn't walk down the stairs. And they were carried down by firefighters or by volunteers who took many trips up. Heroism abounded. Thank you so very much. Heroism abounded in ways that was, it's heart-renderingly difficult to share the story. You listen, we were privileged, I was privileged to listen to the New York City tapes of the firefighters. The sheer gallantry of the people who said things like, "We should try one more time," or "I'm holding somebody, I'm carrying somebody down a flight of stairs." I can't get down in 10 minutes. Do you think I have 10 minutes? And the dispatcher says, no. You should leave them and run away. And the firefighter says, can't do that. I'll go quickly. And dies. And dies. The firefighter chaplain, a gay Catholic priest, talks incessantly into the radio about how he's not allowed to engage in firefighting activity because he's a chaplain, and he's decided to disobey the rules, and he's running up and down the stairs saving people. He too perishes. Good people, people who knew that they were going to die doing this, but who committed themselves to going up and down because they knew every time they went up and down the stairs, they saved the life of another human being. And they must have known that they were playing with fire and eventually were going to die, because the dispatcher said, don't do this again, don't do this again. And they said, one more trip, we'll save 2 more people. You hear firefighters say, should I carry 1 person down or 2 people down? If I carry 2 people down, it'll take me a few more minutes. Terribly tragic stories all the time. And many, many, many people died who could have saved themselves and chose to risk their life to save another, really chose to sacrifice their lives to save another, and not just firefighters and police officers, who I guess maybe you can shrug off and say they're paid to do this. If you listen to the tapes, though, you would know that nobody's paid to do this. But civilians did this. People who had nothing to do other than the fact that they worked on the 13th floor as a financial accountant, and they saw that people on the 27th floor needed help, so they went up to the 27th floor to carry people down. Terrible, incredible bravery. And phone conversations from people. If you were above the 87th floor in the 2nd tower, you could not get down. People, but their cell phones worked. They made terrible phone calls. Terrible, tragic phone calls. Phone calls that said, I'm dying and there's nothing I can do about it. People who said, I will kick open the window and jump out of the 103rd floor because I'm burning to death here. Maybe this will be better. All sorts of terrible, terrible situations arose. And the central question we confronted in each of these situations was, how do we handle the halacha in this situation? We know what the right result is, but it opened our eyes to a variety of halachic activities that I hadn't really invested in. The first thing I discovered was that when you entered the World Trade Center, you had to scan your ID card to show that you went into the building. So a man works at Cantor Fitzgerald, and he scans his ID card to go into the building. That is, in my view, enough halachic evidence that he was on the 103rd floor. And if he was on, by the way, to get into the World Trade Center doesn't have an elevator that goes up 103 floors. There were banks of elevators. And he had to get on the elevator that went to the 90th floor or above. And we could show he stepped in the elevator because he needed to scan his ID card to get into the elevator. And if you scanned your ID card to get into the elevator, that was proof that you had entered the Kivshon H. That was proof that you entered and didn't come out. And to our amazement, we discovered that information like this was routinely backed up. Every 3 minutes, Cantor Fitzgerald backed up all of their records to an off-site computer facility. The New York City Transit records were very good. If you buy a monthly subway pass, it's uniquely yours. And we can tell that you got on the subway. So here's the next question. Somebody gets on the subway at 59th Street at 6:30 in the morning, and they work in the World Trade Center. Is that enough evidence that they went to work? that they were at the World Trade Center? I also think that the halachic evidence is yes. That places them in a situation in which it's reasonable that we now know more than statistical evidence. We know something precise about them. Never mind the hundreds of people who you could prove got on an airplane. That was of enormous importance. When you get on an airplane in the United States, what do? You have to show your ID. You have to show your boarding card, which they scan. That airplane also became the Kivshan Shel H. That airplane became the Kivshan Shel H. No getting off of that airplane. And we went through the cases one at a time, collecting evidence about how do we know that this person was here. It turns out that your cell phone locator can tell you what floor you were on in the World Trade Center. And we identified many people through their cell phones, even in the year 2001. They made a phone call, and we could show which router they made a phone call from in the World Trade Center, proving that they were above a certain point in the World Trade Center. And then, of course, there were more than a few cases where there was some DNA evidence. Thigh bones were the most likely bone to survive, if any bone survived. Your thigh bone was the most likely bone to survive, and the medical examiner in New York, who still has an active World Trade Center file, trying to identify remnants, identified hundreds and hundreds of pieces of biological evidence from family DNA matching. So if you had a relative who you thought perished, you brought in your DNA, and they sought to do a match. This matching system has grown only better over these past few years. I still am on the email list, and once a month now, I still get emails from the New York medical examiner saying we've identified remains of another victim from genetic matching. I think that kind of evidence is also very, very, very important. Case by case, we spent our time going through people whose spouses said, my husband went to work today, and that's it. Not all of them worked in the World Trade Center. There were 100 victims on an A train that was under the World Trade Center. It was people who were going from point A to point B when the World Trade Center collapsed. If you were in that subway tunnel, on that A train when the subway tunnel collapsed, you were gone. 100 people died. They were still running the A train through the World Trade Center subway until the building collapsed. It's an astonishing thing. One of the few demonstrable errors that should have been prevented. But okay, it was very much out of everybody's wheelhouse what was going on. And in each of these situations, you sort of ask, I can prove that this man got on the A train in Brooklyn, and I know he was going to 34th Street and Penn Station. And that's all I know. But I know he got on the A train at 6:42, or I know he got on the platform at 6:42, and that A train that went by, that was the one that was destroyed. Is that enough evidence? I can't show you for sure that he got on that A train, but most people, when they get on the subway and the A train arrives, they don't say, I'll take the next one. That doesn't seem like a reasonable thing to do. Maybe that's enough evidence, and I think, in fact, that is exactly enough evidence. And we went case by case, sort of checking off boxes, saying we now have proof that this person died and this person died, and we wrote to vote for every single person, and then we sent out letters. And I went back to my model of being a chalitza expert. I'm not a chalitza expert, but I learned to become one, because for the first time in America, there were many chalitzas. It hadn't been since World War II that we went back to doing regular chalitzas. Chalitzas were very rare in America because infertility had gotten pretty rare, and young death had gotten pretty rare, because after World War II, Jews avoided combat service. Only in World War II did Jews actually volunteer for combat service in the United States Army. And there were very few of us who had done chalitzas. I did 6 chalitzas in the course of a year or two. It doesn't make me anywhere near an expert, but it makes me a one-eyed fool in a place where many people hadn't even done one. I at least had done a few. These are all of this brought us back to difficult cases. And one hard case sort of arose that we spent a lot of time thinking about, involving a British tourist who went to davening at a minyan in the Upper West Side, early minyan, 6 o'clock, maybe 10 to 6. And afterwards he turned to the rabbi and said, I thought I'd have to work today. I'm flying back to England on the 5 o'clock flight, but I solved my business deal yesterday. I have a day free. What should I do? And the rabbi said, why not go to the World Trade Center? I'll bet you've never been. A month later, we get a letter from this woman saying her husband never came home and disappeared. The rabbi, by the way, doesn't remember the name of the person because, I've been in this boat. You're standing around putting on your tefillin, taking off your tefillin, getting ready to go around the rest of your life, and somebody who's clearly not a member comes to you and says, I don't have a halacha question, but can you be my tour guide? And, you sort of kind of pay a little bit of attention to them because you want to be nice to people. But the rabbi, he sort of circulates and said, does anybody know anything about this? And the rabbi writes to us and says, I have the vague recollection of a man with a British accent approaching me after davening. And I told him, and the rabbi said, I'm sort of embarrassed, and I told him he should go to the World Trade Center. Is that enough? We'll come back to that case in just a little bit. That's a very hard case. But I spent a little while sort of talking to poskim in Israel and in America and in a variety of situations. And I can't tell you it was always uplifting and incredibly rewarding. I found that some poskim in our community were not familiar at all with DNA or science or statistics. I furthermore discovered something even sadder and harder, which is some of them didn't believe in DNA or science or statistics. I went to visit a well-known Hasidic posek in Brooklyn who sort of looked me straight in the face and said, this is all nonsense. How can I possibly believe anything that comes out of these kinds of scientific tests? These are not things found in Chazal. So I sort of looked up and said, thank you. And I left. But I grew disheartened sometimes because what I saw, by the way, and we're seeing it again in the vaccine conversation that's running in our current time, it turns out that, in my view, you're not really qualified to be a competent Mora Hora unless you have a reasonable working knowledge of science and statistics. I don't care if you majored in biochemistry in college. That's not what I'm talking about. Because I saw in my interactions with Rav Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg, who remarked to me one day that he stopped learning any formal secular education in 6th grade. That when he encountered a secular idea that he was not familiar with, he stopped and read a book. Not a Torah book, a secular book. And when you said to him something statistical, he said, I didn't understand this. Can you get somebody to explain it to me? And when you spoke to him about DNA evidence, he said, oh, I read a book on this. And you saw a worldliness about a person who lacked. I majored in biochemistry in college a long time ago, and he lacked that sort of broad worldly education, but not that I had one. But I at least had some collegiate familiarity with science and math. But he had something much better than that. He was a 60-year-old man who was prepared to teach himself things and read anything that needed to be read and learn things at any point with no shame in saying, I don't know enough about this. Can you have somebody send me 3 or 4 articles that I can read? And when you said to him, we don't think there's anything out on this in Hebrew, he said what? Find me somebody who can read the material in English, I remember, with a PhD who will talk to me in Hebrew. He had a high standard for what he needed to learn and know. And he wasn't the only posek who I encountered who said, I don't know this, but I need to learn this. Can you please